There's a stretch of railroad track in northwest Ohio where the locals still remember the afternoon, the sky filled with helicopters, and nobody knew if they should run or stay put. It was May 15th, 2001, and somewhere between Toledo and a small town called Kenton, a freight train was barreling south at nearly 50 miles per hour with absolutely no one at the controls. And the thing that made people's blood run cold wasn't just the speed or the fact that it had been loose for over an hour already. It was what was sitting in two of those tanker cars behind the locomotive. Thousands of gallons of molten phenol, a chemical so nasty that one splash on bare skin causes burns that don't heal right. And if you breathe in enough of the fumes, you're looking at organ damage before you even know what hit you. And this train, all 47 cars of it, was screaming through grade crossings, blasting through small towns, and there was not a single human being anywhere near the throttle. The whole thing started that morning at Stanley Yard in Walbridge, just south of Toledo, which is where CSX runs one of their main classification yards for that part of the country. A locomotive engineer with 35 years on the job was doing what he'd done 1,000 times before, moving a string of cars from one track to another, standard switching work. Nothing unusual about it. The locomotive was number 8888, an EMD SD40-2 that had been kicking around since the Conrail days, and behind it were those 47 freight cars, about half of them loaded, including the two tankers with the phenol. It had been raining that morning. Not heavy, but steady enough to make the rails slick, and when the engineer looked up ahead, he noticed a switch that wasn't lined right. Now, here's where you have to understand how these switching moves work. The train's already rolling, maybe 5 or 6 miles per hour, and you've got maybe a few hundred feet before you hit that switch. He made a quick calculation and figured he couldn't stop in time, so he decided to hop off, throw the switch by hand, and climb back on. Engineers do this kind of thing all the time in yard work. You set your brakes, you jump down, you fix whatever needs fixing, and you climb back up. The problem is what happened in the cab before he left, because when he went to set the locomotive into a braking mode, he made one of those tiny errors that seems like nothing until you realize what it actually means. The SD40-2 has this system where you've got a power throttle and a dynamic brake lever, and they're positioned close enough together that if you're not paying careful attention to which mode you're in, you can think you're applying brake when you're actually feeding power to the traction motors. He pushed that throttle handle thinking he was setting up dynamic braking, but instead he notched it all the way up to 8. Full power, and then he applied the locomotive's air brake on top of that, which for a moment made it feel like everything was fine because the wheels were holding. Then he climbed down. The second his feet hit the ballast and he started walking toward that switch, the locomotive's air brake wasn't enough to fight against full throttle, and 8888 started to move. Not fast at first, just a slow roll. But the engineer looked back and saw it pulling away from him. And in that moment, he had maybe 3 or 4 seconds to make a decision. He ran for it. He grabbed the handrail on the side of the locomotive and tried to pull himself up, but the rain had made everything slippery and the train was accelerating faster than he expected. And what happened next is the kind of thing that stays with a man forever. He got dragged about 80 feet before he lost his grip and went down onto the ballast. By the time he got back to his feet and watched his own train disappearing down the main line, there was nothing he could do. Nobody was in that cab. The throttle was at full power, and 47 cars of freight, including those phenol tankers, were heading south towards some of the most populated corridors in Ohio. What makes this even worse is that the safety systems should have stopped this from happening. Locomotives have what's called a dead man's pedal or alerter system, something that's supposed to detect when there's no engineer at the controls and automatically apply the brakes. But here's the thing about 8888. The alerter had been triggered before the engineer left the cab because he'd been moving the controls, and it had a delay built into it, which meant by the time the system realized nobody was responding, the train was already moving too fast for the automatic brakes to overcome full throttle power. The air brakes on the locomotive itself were applied the whole time, which is why later, when they finally stopped this thing, every single brake shoe on that locomotive had been completely burned away to nothing. The friction of brakes fighting against full engine power for over 60 miles had turned them into molten metal. Meanwhile, back at the yard, people started to realize what was happening. The engineer radioed in that he'd lost his train, and within minutes the dispatchers were trying to figure out where 8888 was headed and what they could do about it. The first idea was simple enough. Put a derailer on the tracks and force the thing off the rails before it could reach a population center. They set up a portable derailer just north of a town called Bowling Green, right at the entrance to a siding, and figured that would be the end of it. What they didn't account for was that a locomotive running at nearly 50 miles per hour with that much tonnage behind it doesn't give a damn about a portable derailleur designed to stop slow-moving equipment in a yard. When 8888 hit that derailleur, it didn't derail. It threw the derailleur off the tracks like it was made of cardboard and kept right on going. Now the helicopters were in the air. News crews had picked up the story from police scanners, and suddenly this wasn't just a railroad problem anymore. It was a live television event with aerial footage showing this unmanned freight train blasting through grade crossings while people in their cars sat there wondering what they'd just seen. The Ohio State Highway Patrol started clearing crossings ahead of the train, trying to make sure nobody was in the path when it came through. At one point, a state trooper got the idea to try something that sounds insane until you understand how desperate everyone was getting. He pulled his cruiser alongside the moving train, leaned out the window, and started shooting at the locomotive. Not at the engineer because there wasn't one. He was shooting at the fuel cutoff button on the side of the locomotive, a big red button that's supposed to shut down the engine if you press it. The problem is that on these former Conrail SD40-2s, that button has to be pressed for several seconds before it actually does anything, and a bullet impact isn't the same as sustained pressure. 3 shots hit the locomotive, but they struck the fuel cap instead of the cutoff, and 8888 didn't even slow down. By now, more than an hour had passed, and the train had covered something like 40 miles. CSX was running out of options and running out of track. There was another freight train somewhere up ahead, and beyond that was the town of Kenton with a grade crossing right in the middle of a populated area. They needed to stop this thing, and they needed to do it soon. That's when someone came up with the only plan that had any real chance of working. Get another locomotive behind the runaway and couple onto the last car. If you could attach a chase engine and apply its dynamic brakes against the momentum of the whole train, you might be able to slow it down enough for someone to board and shut off the power. It was dangerous as hell, but it was all they had. A northbound freight called Q636 was ordered onto a siding to let the runaway pass. And the crew, an engineer named Jess Knowlton with 31 years on the railroad and a conductor named Terry Forson, uncoupled their locomotive CSX 8392 and waited. When 8888 went screaming by them, they pulled out of the siding and started the chase. What followed was about 10 miles of trying to catch up to a runaway train, matching its speed, and then doing something that takes either incredible skill or incredible recklessness, or probably both. Knowlton brought 8392 right up against the rear coupler of the last freight car, while both trains were still moving at speed, and Forson made the connection. They were now attached to the runaway, and Knowlton started applying his dynamic brakes against the weight of the whole consist. Slowly, it started to work. The speed began to drop. 50 miles per hour became 40. 40 became 30. And somewhere around the edges of Kenton, when the train had slowed to about 12 miles per hour, a CSX trainmaster named John Hosfeld did something that most people would call crazy and railroad people would call necessary. He ran alongside the lead locomotive, grabbed the handrail, pulled himself up into the cab of 8888, and put his hands on the throttle. He pulled it back to idle, applied the independent brakes, and brought the train to a stop at a grade crossing on State Route 31 just southeast of Kenton. The whole ordeal had lasted just under 2 hours and covered 66 miles. When they inspected the locomotive afterward, the brake shoes were completely gone, worn down to bare metal from fighting against full throttle the entire way. The phenol tankers hadn't spilled a drop. Nobody had been injured. Not even the engineer who'd been dragged 80 feet at the start of this whole mess. By every measure that mattered, this was a miracle. A runaway train carrying hazardous chemicals had been stopped before it could cause a disaster, and the only damage was to equipment and to the reputation of a 35-year veteran whose name CSX never released to the public. But here's what sticks with people who know railroads, and what makes this story more than just a wild afternoon in Ohio. The 8888 incident happened because of a combination of factors that all lined up at exactly the wrong moment. A slippery rail, a misread throttle position, a safety alerter that didn't kick in fast enough, and a locomotive design where the controls could be easily confused under pressure. None of those things have been completely solved. The alerter systems got better, and positive train control eventually came along to prevent certain kinds of runaways. But the fundamental reality of moving thousands of tons of steel and cargo across hundreds of miles of track is that human error is always one bad second away from catastrophe. The only reason this story ended well is because a handful of railroad men did something extraordinary under pressure and got lucky at the same time. 9 years later, Tony Scott made a movie about it called Unstoppable, with Denzel Washington and Chris Pine playing fictionalized versions of the heroes who stopped the runaway. The movie was set in Pennsylvania instead of Ohio, and it cranked up the speed and the danger and added some Hollywood explosions, but the core of the story was true. An unmanned train, a desperate chase, and a couple of railroad guys who refused to let it end badly. John Hosfeld, the trainmaster who actually boarded 8888, served as a consultant on the film. When production wrapped, he went back to his regular job. The locomotive itself got rebuilt and renumbered a few years later, turned into an SD40-3, and sent back out on the rails as CSX 4389, still running freight somewhere in the system like nothing ever happened. But people who were there that day, the ones who cleared those grade crossings and watched those helicopters overhead and wondered if they were about to see something terrible unfold on live television, they remember. And somewhere in Northwest Ohio, there are still folks who can tell you exactly where they were standing when the Crazy Eights came through.